Okay, this is lecturette number 1 for Masters of Divinity level Old Testament Survey 1. This is the syllabus that you have by now, and I'm on the class schedule page of the syllabus just to make sure we're on the same page. All of the articles that I've given you here are available in Blackboard as PDF downloads. There's the required textbook. So, for example, week 1 is what we'll be covering in today's lecturette overview, is stuff that I've put together in lecture, but also based on the reading here that you would do before class. And then what you would do before class is do your theological high point, but we're not covering a book until down here. So what I want you to do here is to record a summary of some of the high points that you've picked up in your reading based on that assigned reading in this box here. So that's something you can put in your Blackboard journal for the first week of class. And then the voice thread, as you see and read in the syllabus, is something that is on the back end of that week. So the voice thread, for example, the first week's voice thread is not a heavy hitter. It's just a getting to know you as kind of a practice. Get you into VoiceThread, get you registered in your VoiceThread account, and then set you up for the whole semester. So that's a new tool. You've probably never seen it before, maybe you have, but it's something pretty intuitive. And again, if you have any issues or technology questions about that, just give my office a call at extension 5831. So now let's talk about the PowerPoints, and I want to give you a quick overview of what I've put in the PowerPoints. Of course, if you are on campus and going to the classroom, some of the things that are in the PowerPoints we'd be covering in class. It's my attempt to kind of give an overview of some of the high points of what we've been reading, and then dig a little deeper in class. So that's the purpose of this quick overview, is to get you thinking that way as well, even though you're not in the classroom, but you are in your classroom. You're just sitting in a Starbucks or sitting at home in your favorite easy lazy boy recliner chair. So let me come back and pause, and I'll come right back. So the PowerPoint presentation, or the slide set's a pretty big file. The reason is I've embedded some videos in there that you can watch on your own and get the gist. But this first little set of slides is just an interest of mine that I talk about, and you can read. You can see the slide and read my caption down below. It gives you a sense of how, according to some experts, there's nothing that significant about planet Earth. It's just a small little blue dot there. They're looking through the Voyager 1 spacecraft, taking pictures through one of the rings of Saturn, I believe. Nope, that's the next one. There we go. That's what we look like through the rings of Saturn, and through a beam light way out, 6.4 billion kilometers away. Oops, I misspelled that word. There we go. Keep going. So we talk about how big the Milky Way galaxy is, and there's our location in the Milky Way galaxy. As you know, if you go to a pancake place, you're going to see what the Milky Way looks like if you put the egg right in the middle of a pancake, flat and kind of bulged in the middle. Interestingly, from the top you see that here we are on the Orion spur. There's our sun. So our solar system is located just on the edge of the Orion spur, and it's interesting when you look up at the night sky. You see that if you're out in West Texas near the McDonald Observatory in the Davis Mountains of West Texas, one of the darkest places in the United States, you see the Milky Way galaxy. You're looking into the edge of our galaxy. That's the thickest part. But the fact that we can look out into deep space is all because of our unique location right on the edge of that spur, because we're looking essentially out of your computer screen, both down and out towards you looking in. That's the direction that we look when we look into deep space. So that's what the Hubble telescope has been doing for us. Here's one of the first videos that you can play on your own. It gives you a sense of how big the universe is. Kind of cool. But what's interesting is that the unique location of our planet Earth is in what's called the habitable zone. And it's just the, you might say, the Goldilocks rule, the just right temperature, just the right location. The Earth, in other words, all the unique things about where we're located in our solar system as well as the universe is pretty amazing. It really is almost as if we were uniquely placed. And I like to, remind people, and you can use this with your youth groups or your, Sunday school classes. I'm giving you this PowerPoint if you want to use it to help people just capture their hearts and their faith imagination just regards to how big the universe is. And I go back to some of those places where some of the great examples of faith, even some who struggled with their faith, like Abraham. And you read about him in his faith struggle in Genesis 15, there in verses 1 through 5, where he's questioning God's plan A for his life, and he hasn't had a son, he and Sarah, and they're struggling, and he's worried about what next and what's the future, and it's all going to come crashing in. And God gently reminds him and taps him on the shoulder and says, get out of your tent, stop moping, go out and look up at the night sky and count the stars. Which is pretty amazing because we're still counting stars. And that's what Genesis 15 invites us to do. Of course, Psalm 19 invites us to worship God through our understanding of the universe and how big the night sky is. And we're still counting stars. What's the number that I have here? There we go. We're still counting stars. Somewhere here I have the exact number of stars that we're still counting. 1 times 10 to the 21st power, I believe, in the known universe. And not only that, just as we're continuing to learn more about life and the human body and the nature of cells and all the way down to the DNA and how DNA works, this is a pretty amazing slide just that shows just one process. How much activity is going on behind the scenes, and we don't even know it. Every second of every minute of every day, your body organizes on the order of 150,000 amino acids into carefully constructed chains of proteins. Every second, every minute, every day. That's what your body is doing. Now, talk about intelligent design. Talk about God, the simple truth of Genesis 1, that God is not only the creator of life, but he's the sustainer of life. And I'll leave it to you to find those texts, those New Testament passages even, that talk about God as the one who sustains life. It's just amazing. So people who question, origins of life, and some of the people in your Sunday school classes, and even some of the students in your youth group, this is a unique video that just talks about one of those systems that's unique to life. That is how a cell repairs itself. For example, if you get a cut on your skin, this is an amazing thing that shows you all of the things that happen behind the scenes. Again, you take that process away from the human cell, the cell would die. It wouldn't be able to live. Here I talk about briefly just the, how Darwinian evolution, the full-blown Darwinian evolution, not microevolution, which is just small change and small adaptation over time, but we're talking about origin of life. How did life begin? So that the idea of the origin of species or speciation, new species being formed from just the random processes of mutations and natural selection or survival of the fittest. That's all that Darwinian evolutions have to go on in terms of the processes or the forces that move things ahead from less complex to more complex. But here are all of the different processes that are absolutely bare minimum necessary for life. And I'll let you read those, and then look at the list down here in the notes section. And by the way, these are all for you to read as part of your online learner requirement. There's 6 different theories as to how all of these processes came to be, really necessarily almost at the same time in order for life to exist, because all of those processes are basically banking on each other in order for life to flourish and to grow. And by the way, you need to have a living critter in order for the processes of survival of the fittest and the random mutation, or the DNA basically uh, forming mutations in those. You have to have something that's living. So it's kind of a circular argument all around in order to try to figure out, well, how did life come about in the beginning? You need something that has existed previously or for eternity, and that's the basic thesis of Genesis 1 that we'll get into soon. All right? I've given you another video to watch if you want to there, and here's a picture of a lot of activity going on right now with regards to the search for extraterrestrial life, or the SETI program. Of course, we've sent some rovers up to Mars, and this is what they found. There it is. So we're still searching for intelligence. By the way, the intelligence that is necessary for the formation of life cannot be found on other planets. In other words, Darwinian evolution could not have produced that level of intelligence. It had to have come from another planet. That's the whole seeding idea behind one of the theories that I showed you on that other slide. So all to say, welcome to Old Testament Survey. So we'll put our running shoes on, and I've shown you some pictures of my family. We've been around the world. I took my whole family over to Russia a number of years ago. Most recently just got back from China. So much for the underground church. There it is, big red cross on the top of this 7-story building, and that's a mega church in China, in Wenzhou. Pretty amazing. My family, I take them all over the place. We love to travel. Cadillac Graveyard, Grand Canyon, all over the place. My son, we're out at Philmont a couple years ago, and this summer he got a job out there working at Philmont. And there's my little devil dog right there, and my daughter. She made color guard captain this year. I'm really proud of her. And James just graduated. There we are. And he's moving down to Austin to do a Plan 2 honors program down there. So we're really, really proud of him. All right. Well, what about the Old Testament? Do you think it's ever misunderstood in your churches? This little Calvin and Hobbes cartoon illustrates the misconception. I mean, basically, we all hear right. There's the God of the Old Testament. There's the God of the New Testament. God of the Old Testament's mean and vindictive, and mean and vindictive, and he likes war, and he's mean and vindictive. The God of the New Testament, well, he's all grace. He's all love. He's the one who we really want to get to know. Not the God of the Old Testament. We'll leave him and keep those books closed, and we won't read those because that's just old and archaic and out of date. You've heard this before. I know you have. Well, the basic problem is really that the Old Testament is trivialized. So I'm going to talk briefly here, and I'll let you read these on your own largely, but 7 symptoms, 7 reasons, and 3 effects. So, I'll let you look at this a little more yourself, but symptoms of the trivialization of the Old Testament, you see that it's only used for illustrations for sermons on the New Testament, right? Or it's just used as a proof text. There's something that I want to prove, and I'll just go to the Old Testament and just kind of use my Strong's Concordance and keyword searches and find those verses that help me prove what I want to prove from something in the New Testament. We think that the Old Testament presents its main characters as great examples of faith. Well, what we're going to see is they're presented warts and all. Or we see an over-spiritualization of the Old Testament. Or the problem of only reading the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament. Or the pressure that we have to find Christ or Jesus on every page of the Old Testament. Or even that, that the Old Testament is a source for Christian magic. Do you remember that fad called the Bible Code or Prayer of Jabez? Some of those things. So I'll let you read that on your own. We talk about the trivialization or the reasons. So we say that the Old Testament is obsolete now that Christ has come. Of course, I'm telling you this because all of these are fallacies. And in my class, by the end, hopefully I'll have you convinced. The Old Testament is old, so it's not relevant for modern man or new man. The Old Testament presents a God who's wrathful, judgmental, and just outright mean. Or, this is huge, The Old Testament presents a form of ball and chain legalism. Like Moses comes down from the Mount Sinai and he introduces this very legalistic ball and chain for Israel in terms of what was, I will argue later, revolutionary and gracious in its day. I'll just leave you in suspense. Also, this basic line in the sand between the Old Testament law and the New Testament grace emphasis. Of course, I'll show you what law means. Law is actually a word that means to teach. So the Torah, which is based on that Hebrew word, really is about instruction. And then the Old Testament presents a system, very detailed system, or salvation by works. Well, that's because the New Testament authors, like Paul, was trying to convince his group that there was legalism in the first century Jewish church. But what was true and what Moses introduced in his context and in his day, they approached God through faith the same way we do. So I'll just leave you in suspense. We'll talk more about that when we get to it. So the effects of this, basically, we have people in our churches that are ignorant of the Old Testament. There's an underexposure or an interpretation of the New Testament. In fact, you can't really understand the New Testament unless you have a firm understanding of the Old Testament. So the result is people, even though they wouldn't admit it, they're basically carrying around with them a low-grade view of biblical inspiration, authority, and inerrancy with regards to the Old Testament. And I just want to remind you here, make sure you're reading your narrative notes down here below. But what was the Bible of the first century church? When Paul wrote, all Scripture in 2 Timothy 3:16 is inspired by God. All Scripture, what was he referring to? You all know, don't you? It's the Old Testament. So that's pretty significant. I'll let you open up this slide in your own computer, but it just basically kind of structures the Old Testament. One thing that I did want to show is this slide. This is a little bit hard to read, but the books in red are the history books. And those are the books that basically advance the history of salvation, Israel's salvation with God. The green books are those wisdom books, and the blue books are the prophetic books. And where they intersect in history, which really takes you up to the very top line, is pretty significant. What I like to point out in this slide is showing you where the prophets were. God raised up these prophets and spoke through the prophets to what audience? Look at where they all line up. They're anticipating the fall of Israel, the fall of the northern tribes in 722, 586, and then post-exilic prophets come along after the return. So that's, the prophetic activity is all concentrated in these three different areas. We'll talk about that actually next spring when we get to the prophet books. I throw this slide up just because it's kind of interesting. Here's a quote from Ecclesiastes chapter 6 on the right, and on the left is a Pink Floyd song. But it's really interesting how the themes that the Bible introduces and discusses and wrestles with, like Ecclesiastes and its focus on time and the futility of life and the sense of inward sense of struggle over trying to make sense of life and meaning in life. I mean, you read those two and compare. It's really interesting. Hey, guess what Pink Floyd dealt with in some of their songs? The same thing. So we'll get to that. Well, of course, Ecclesiastes will have to wait till spring. But that's something that we miss out on, right? If we don't understand our Old Testament and make it come alive for our youth groups and our Sunday school classes, and if you are called to be a preacher, your Sunday sermons. So one of the things that comes out in your reading that we want to just focus a little bit on is with the big question is, how did we get our Bible? We talk about from text to canon. That is the canon of Scripture is basically the arrangement or the ordering of the books that we have in our Old Testament as well as our New Testament. So, the starting points that we have are the idea of inspiration. We have the human and divine author. So the complete Bible is God's self-revelation and to various groups at various times in history. So if we develop an approach to interpretation, what we want to do is take into consideration that God was speaking to individual authors who were writing in a historical context to a real historical audience. So what they have to say was directed to a particular group of people at a particular time. Unfortunately, we don't have the autographs. That is, we don't have the originals. So what about inspiration? The Chicago Statement that I sign as a professor to teach at Southwestern affirms the inspiration applies only to the autographs. But what we do have is we have a canon of Scripture. We don't have the autographs, but we have those copies. We'll talk about the fact that we have copies of the books that were originally written in the autographs in a little bit later. But basically, what is canon? Is just a recognition that what are those the list of books that belong in the Bible. So F. Bruce defines the canon as the list of books that are reckoned as holy scriptures, reckoned as supremely authoritative for belief and conduct. And it's important to know that in the history of the history of the canonization of the Old Testament as well as the New, we have the believing community at any given time in history that were doing that authentication. So from Moses to Malachi, or Malachi, the Italian prophet, the church, the believing community, was the one that will recognize which books were authoritative and from God. So the final recognition process, the 22 books or 24 of the Jewish canon and the 39 books of the Protestant canon, that is the canon that we have of the Old Testament, those are the books that gave us. So when we talk about how we got our Bible, one of the things we want to make sure that we have clear is who the author is. And any of the authors, whether we know them by name or not, are inspired. And what that means is they are inspired. That's the primary designation, but they also are working in a context that would also include lots of different input sources. So we talk about primarily three. Direct revelation. So you have the face-to-face reference there, for example, Hebrews 1, Numbers 12:8, which acknowledges Moses talking to God face-to-face. You have the "Thus saith the Lord," for example, from the prophetic texts. Now we have written records. The authors, the inspired authors of the Old Testament had available to them written records. For example, Chronicles. The book of Chronicles draws from the narratives of Samuel and Kings, the biblical texts, but also from non-canonical sources, such as genealogical records, official documents, and other historical records, such as what's quoted as the book of the Kings of Israel and Judah, some kind of a written source. We don't have that source, but the author of Chronicles is using it in his inspired text. And prophetic writings that include chronicles of Samuel, Nathan, and Gad. Now, oral sources. This gets a little tricky, but we have evidence of cultures being able to preserve things quite well through an oral transmission over time. Now, inspiration and infallibility is applied to the inspired biblical author who may have had access to an oral tradition. I think Moses is being the educated one who finds his historical roots in Israel, and those Israelites who were in Egyptian bondage. You've got some time that passes, 400 years, between the period of the patriarchs to the time that Moses enters the scene. What was being preserved over that time could have been a combination, or at least in the earliest days, of somewhat of an oral transmission or oral tradition that would have led eventually to a written down historical record. So Moses may have had access to both as he was writing down his inspired text, which starts with Genesis in the earliest records, but then eventually catches up with the real-time events that Moses, he himself, experienced, beginning there in Exodus and moving on through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, where Moses is for the large part an eyewitness to all that happened. So here's a illustration that kind of gives you an idea. From Moses to the close of the Canon, that is of the Old Testament, we have a period of about, which is around 400 BC. We have a period of about 1,000 years. And over that 1,000 years, we have cultures that change, languages that are updated and change over time. We're going to have scribal updates in terms of clarifying things in terms and updating it in language. I mean, there's things like that are occurring over that 1,000-year period, and we call this the inscripturation process. So we start with the first draft, one might say, and at every point along the way, if we have small editorial revisions, though minimal, to the final draft, that's the final canonical form, we have divine inspiration that applies to the entire process. I think that has something to do with the God-breathed idea in 2 Timothy 3:16. So really what we're talking about here is two primary stages. From the very, very beginning, when the author inspired wrote it all down without error, and we have somewhat of a non-inspired with some minor error process. Two processes: inspired transmission of the text, and then we have the textual updating. So we have this early period with the Old Testament still under construction in wet cement, where the composition of the Old Testament has to do with the transmission of the text through the original autograph and anything along the way. The close of the Testament canon, Old Testament canon, in 400 BC, and this is where we have a hard break, a hard wall. And then from that point on, all we have is really the domain of textual criticism. We are in a period where we are meticulously hand copying the Old Testament from century to century and moving it ahead in history. So we've just got largely scribal activity from that point on. So we're not changing the text intentionally. No, these are scribes whose job was largely to meticulously and accurately hand copy, before the days of copying machines, the text of the Old Testament. So what I do here is give you an example, one example anyway, of what would be an example of an inspired textual update. And that would be, the account of Moses' death in Deuteronomy 34, starting in verse 5. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of Yahweh. He was buried, and he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor, but no man knows his burial place to this day. Look, I think, as a fitting tribute to the author of the Pentateuch, you've got probably a scribe of Joshua adding that little last bit to kind of put that final capstone on the entire Pentateuch as a tribute to the author Moses. Now, do we have to agree that Moses wrote that still to legitimately hold to biblical inspiration and inerrancy and authority? No, we don't have to say Moses wrote that, but we have an inspired author who's working to add that as a fitting tribute to the author, as a capstone to the end of the Pentateuch. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. At any stage along the way, God, through His Holy Spirit, is overseeing the original writing of and the slightly updating over time process that's behind the Old Testament. So I think I'm going to pause here and break this up into two parts. So this is first week, and you will continue on with this slide, and you'll see this next week. So I'll save this for the next set. So I hope this has been helpful in giving you a quick overview. You've got some reading to do on your own and some thinking, but I'll try to keep it a little more precise next time. Thanks for your attention.